Welcome to STS 330, Information Technology and Globalization, a class at Arizona State University in the Science, Technology, and Society program. We have this week, or last week, I had the class read a piece on internet governance and prepare questions for today's lecture. Perhaps the best question that summarizes almost all of the questions of the class comes from Glenn Savage, and she writes, "Therefore my question is this: in a world of diverse beliefs and governments, how can we have a truly open internet that allows secure exchanges of information and protects the privacy of citizens of the world that use it?" And I think this is there's a great contradiction between those of us who want to use the internet but want to preserve our privacy and make sure that we're not exploited by those who will do us harm, and there are those that want to control their property, especially their intellectual property, and want to make sure that it is not that they are compensated for its use and they have control over it. And so we want the government to preserve our rights, and yet we're afraid of Big Brother. And also we have this problem that the internet is global, and we live with national governments, and there is no international treaty currently that really says what due process is in terms of government's ability to monitor and filter the internet. So anyway, this is a very important question. Cody also asked the same question about the relationship between privacy and internet governance. One of the examples that David Van Gaal pointed out to is the whole issue that BlackBerries maker RIM has a very strong encryption in their email client, and in order for the RIM to be able to sell their product in countries like Saudi Arabia and India, they've had to turn over the keys to this encryption into the encryption scheme, so that those countries can make sure that the BlackBerry email is not used for organized crime or for anything against the state's interests. Also, one can assume that NSA has the ability to break into all BlackBerry communications. Bailey raised a very interesting question. He said, how can your work, your employer, judge you on your Facebook self? And I think it reminds me of what Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, said, which was that if you don't want it on the internet, don't do it. And I think we are moving into an era of the global village in which there is no distinction between the private and the public self. But in the meantime, I would also urge you to be very careful in terms of what you do on Facebook and on the internet in terms of what it might mean to potential or existing employers. Deep packet encryption is basically breaking into the internet packets that make up the internet and looking for things like illegal activity or copyright infringement, etc. I believe that there is certainly a role for government to do. A number of you asked questions about peering agreements between internet service providers and deep packet inspection as to whether deep packet, as to whether the ISPs, the internet service providers, should be doing deep packet encryption, and whether they should be doing that, whether they should be required to do that, whether they're responsible for the traffic of their employers, which up to now courts have ruled they're not, or whether they are actually providing protection to copyright owners. And so that Joshua asked a very good question about that. And yet there is this issue of privacy. If the government is snooping into each packet on the internet, and that it certainly attacks internet privacy. But on the other hand, I'm going back and forth on this, Alana said, how can consumer trust when not managed, regulated, or enforced? And so that if we want to have trust, and We on one hand need relationships of trust between individuals and between companies and between internet service providers and between governments, but there is certainly a role for the government to play in guaranteeing trust. Adam asked about freedom of expression versus state sovereignty and corporate responsibility, and again, I think this is right, that there is a responsibility of all organizations and individuals in the world to work together to guarantee freedom of expression. Amanda also asked about internet and copyright, just to show you that a lot of you are interested in copyright issues, and so did Ryan. Colin asked a good question about, with Google having 80% of the search traffic, what about monopoly? What about it being charged as a monopoly? And we do remember that Microsoft, after it destroyed Netscape in the browser wars, ended up in court with the Justice Department attacking it on monopoly grounds. And it was probably because of that Google was able to be so successful and was not squashed by Microsoft. There's a very excellent book or an excellent book called The Master Switch that talks about the battles between Google and Yahoo and Microsoft and Apple and Facebook for control over the master switch of the internet, and I certainly recommend reading that book. Peering agreements are actually the agreements between internet service providers as to who carries whose traffic and how much they charge for that, and also for other things that could be done, such as deep packet inspection. Philemon asked a question about, do peering agreements lead to oligopolies? And I think we saw in the US the case where we had 10,000 internet service providers in 1998, and by the year 2000 most of us had the only option of going to 3 or 4 internet service providers in the country, and part of this was because of the interpretation of the Telecommunications Act and the way peering agreements and the ability of internet service providers to access the telecommunication carriers' equipment worked. So it's a very good question. Christopher asked about the governance of search engines and whether one can deal with things like net neutrality through algorithms that are based on the search engines. So a couple of you mentioned, James Wise mentioned the Stuxnet, which was a virus that was created by the Israelis and the US intelligence agencies to destabilize the Iranian centrifuges through attacking their network, and that virus has actually gotten out over the internet. And this week I've asked you to read a piece in Vanity Fair about Stuxnet and get your opinion as to whether the US and Israel had the power and the right to unleash this virus on the global community. Joshua also asked about the Stuxnet virus. Also, I asked you to read an article in The Economist from a couple months ago about whether there needs to be a treaty for cyber warfare to say what can and can't be done in terms of espionage between countries, and how do espionage how can we make sure that it does not undermine our trust in the whole system? And because one of the things we've seen over and over again is that governments, in being involved in cyber espionage, often make relationships with hackers and the hacker community, and that often the technologies that are developed by the state or funded by the state end up being used for organized crime or terrorist purposes. Bradley John talked about the CIPV, which is basically a way that the federal government is able to keep track of what everyone is doing on the internet and from where they're doing it, and also NSA is using its CIPV stands for Computer and Internet Protocol Address Verifier, and how NSA is using that to track what's happening around the world with the internet. So that there's this big question that Bradley asked about CIPV and privacy. So that Bo asked a big question about internet crime and can the government do anything. In fact, her family or his family, I'm not sure which Bo is, was contacted over the internet phone from China, saying that he was going to be kidnapped unless his family put up money. And there was no way, because of the fact that it was over the internet phone and it was involving China, that the U.S. government was able to do anything. Hannah asked about hacking into defense contractors and what can be done about that. It's a real problem, in as much as we've seen things like that, hackers getting into the drone communications, and have been using that to understand the U.S. military and to fight against it. Kaylee asked about net neutrality and whether you could use algorithms to enforce net neutrality. I think it's an interesting idea, but I don't think it is going anywhere. In terms of net neutrality, which again is the government, which is to make sure that the government plays a role in making sure that ISPs don't discriminate against content providers or what users are doing, and provide just pure internet access and not differentiated according to price. Brandon asked about cyberbullying. Again, I don't think the government as much should be involved, but there's certainly a way for government, schools, and families to work together. So anyway, Joshua asked a question: with an increasing number of attacks on government and key systems like NASDAQ, will we see an increasing effort on the part of U.S. to control what can and can't be accessed on the net? And I think, yes, we will. I think we don't realize the extent to which monitoring is going on, but I think we will see more and more enforcement, especially if we have a real major disaster. It was stated, Amy goes, it was stated in the beginning of the reading that there was no policy-making authority or enforcement mechanisms in internet governance. If this is the case, then how is it safe to transfer credit card or social security numbers over the internet? The answer is it's not safe. And we need to put in place a regime that makes these kinds of things safe. Finally, the final question is from Juliana. My question concerning internet governance is in regards to the U.S. control debate. Do you feel that it's more conducive to have individual governments take part, or perhaps invoking the United Nations and having ultimate control? I personally feel now that more countries are involved with the web IP domain network, they should be more self-monitored, with ultimate control going to the UN. Yes, the UN, especially the International Telecommunications Union, has a role to play in ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which controls DNS. There are also things like the ISC, which the Internet Software Consortium, which is developing a way of using DNS to filter DNS to keep nefarious groups off the internet. And I think we see a combination of government, private corporation, and individual activities together, creating the kind of trust that we need. Thank you very much.